Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode we meet some true life singing fishermen in Fisherman's Friends. Record executive Danny, played by Daniel Mays, joins his boss Troy, played by Noel Clarke, and their friends on a stag-do bachelor weekend in Port Isaac in Cornwall. Whilst there, they discover a group of local fishermen singing sea shanties in a group called Fisherman's Friends, led by James Purefoy's Jim, and Troy pranks Danny by making him try to sign them to a record deal and stranding him in the village. But Danny has given Jim and his fisherman his word and is determined to honour it, all the while falling for Jim's daughter Alwyn, played by Tuppence Middleton, increasingly charmed by the slower tempo of Cornish life. The Fisherman's Friends are a real-life group. They're a real-life band of fishermen who, when they're not fishing or rescuing, they're singing sea shanties to the delight of visitors and locals to the Cornish village of Port Isaac. In fact, that's actually how they got discovered. In 2009, BBC Radio 2 presenter Johnny Walker was on holiday there, and he stumbled across them and bought some of their homebrew CDs, which he brought to the attention of his agent, who in turn led them to Universal Music Group, who picked them up for a record deal, was surprisingly charted in the top 10 in the UK. That's ostensibly the story that this movie is portraying, but even though it bills itself as being based on a true story, which even appears in the film's opening title card, all this really has in touch with reality is that yes, there was a bunch of fishermen, they did call themselves the Fisherman's Friends, and they got themselves a record deal. Everything else around it is pretty much fiction. Although I should mention that the movie deal wasn't that far behind the record deal. In 2010 they appeared on ITV's This Morning to promote their album, an incident which is actually related in this film. Eamon Holmes and Ruth Langford, the hosts of that show, make cameos in this movie, and that brought them to the attention of producers Nick Moorcraft and Meg Leonard, who also wrote the script for this movie, and they acquired the rights to their story. They would go on to have success with the dancing comedy Finding Your Feet, and Fisherman's Friends, the film, is very much in the same vein. It's catered towards an older audience, and it's the kind of movie that can become a bit of a sleeper hit. It may not necessarily open huge, but it plays well all week round. It's the kind of movie that does a lot of its business in weekday matinees and can get a lot of business gradually over a long period of time, and that's pretty much what has happened with Fisherman's Friends. It's actually become quite successful over here and has played very well with audiences. And I know I'm not really the target demographic, but maybe I was charmed by it. But I wasn't really. Fisherman's Friends, the film, takes a fairly familiar structure, that of the city slicker that goes out to the country and finds herself unexpectedly won over by the quiet life. It's the kind of tale that we've seen countless iterations of time and time again. It's pretty much the Doc Hollywood formula, the only difference being that Daniel Mays isn't as charming as Michael J. Fox, but I'm pretty sure he knows that. Now that's not necessarily a handicap. That's not necessarily a thing to hold against the movie. In fact, for a crowd pleaser like this one, that's actually probably a benefit, because everyone is on the same page. Everyone knows from frame one exactly where this is going, but they care more about the journey, not the destination. This kind of movie succeeds on what kind of colour and life it brings to its tale, and in the case of Fisherman's Friends, that's where I think it falls short. It falls really short, in fact, because it read to me a lot of the time like it was strangely indifferent about its own structure. And this can be seen in the way the film just sets up its own plot. Now, I understand why they had to make a fictionalised version of this tale, because the reality is boring and straightforward. It wouldn't make for a very good film. I accept that. I'm not holding the fact that it's really not based on reality against it. That's not why it doesn't work for me. The problem is that the plot of the film, I think, is needlessly convoluted. You've got so many variables just to get Danny to the point where he's managing the Fisherman's Friends. So he has to have a stag do in Cornwall, so one of his friends is getting married there, they're all record executives, their boss is going with them. Incidentally, Noel Clarke's performance as Troy is terrible. Like, he is attempting one of the worst American accents I have ever heard. It's so bad, I actually wondered, what accent is that? It's that bad. So they're all going together on this bachelor party, they get rescued by the fisherman, then they hear them sing, and then Troy pranks him into trying to get him to sign a deal while they abandon him in the village. And then it turns out there's no cell phone reception in the village, so Danny has to go out to the shore every time he wants to make a call, or except when the plot needs it to and they forget about that particular plot point. So that is all the different variables just in the first half an hour, 20 minutes of this movie, just to get to the point where the film is beginning. And then after that point, the movie just shambles along. It seems like it's not really committed to itself. It's just going in various different directions. The aforementioned wedding occurs about halfway through the film, but it's not really given that much prominence, aside from the fact that it's a place where the fisherman can gig to the record executives, and it's not really that much of a major sequence in the movie. And Troy, who is set up as the film's antagonist, after about the halfway point, he's barely in the movie. He only appears in a couple of very brief scenes afterwards. So the movie doesn't even commit to what it's set out to do in the first place. And maybe the sort of ambling structure of the film may actually be somewhat charming to some audiences, but I found it really kind of tedious and frustrating. The main plot of the film isn't even about the fisherman, it's about Danny, it's about his arc, and I honestly wasn't all that engaged with it because, yeah, Daniel Mays is a good character actor. I've liked him in other things before, but I don't think he's a good leading man. I don't think he's the kind of person that can carry a whole movie. He's fairly forgettable in it, although granted, he's not exactly been given the greatest of material in the world. And really not helping matters is the romantic subplot with Alwyn, played by Tuppence Middleton, falls totally flat because the two performers have no chemistry with each other whatsoever. They're going through the standard rom-com motions of, oh, they hate each other on the meet cute, and then gradually over time there's a thaw, and then they begin to like each other. But the problem is that when the actors don't make you believe in it, it just reveals itself as being rote and a bunch of cliches. So there are scenes where they're bonding over Alwyn's record collection and she's saying things like, oh, Steve Jobs was such a hypocrite because he was peddling iPods, but when he went home he listened to his records. And I go, I do not believe in this one iota. Incidentally, that is one of many examples of anti-technology all throughout this film as a running theme, which, you know, makes sense given the traditionalism of the movie and the audience that it's playing towards. But this romantic subplot is a microcosm of the film at large because it really does feel like it's a little bit half-hearted when it comes to telling its story. It seems to be that, yeah, we've got the band that everyone likes locally, and so we've got the audience involved. You know, the audience knows this story already, so we don't really need to put too much effort into it. And so you get plot elements that feel really forced because it has to follow the rigid structure of this story beat for beat for beat, and sometimes major plot moments happen totally off screen. Danny leaves his record label halfway through the movie and it's just delivered in a line of dialogue. What? Weren't these guys his friends? Isn't that supposed to be a major scene? It gave me a lot of time to think about, well, why isn't it focused on the fisherman? That's who this movie is meant to be about, right? And yet so much of this movie gravitates towards a fictional character going on a fictional journey rather than the real-life band that presumably the audience has come here to see. It's a really odd decision, exacerbated by the fact the fisherman's friends are sidelined in their own film. Only maybe 3 or 4 of them get any kind of characterization. Obviously you got Jim, played by James Purefoy, who is the de facto leader of the group, who pretty much speaks for them whenever he's on screen. You got the one played by Dave Johns of I, Daniel Blake. You got the one that runs the pub, which we'll get back to later. But most of the best moments in this film is when it actually focuses upon the fishermen. Like, there's an episode where they go up to London and they go to a pub and they get speaking to the locals and they discuss sea shanties and everyone starts singing one together. That's a really great, infectious sequence that gets their appeal in the way that I think a lot of the rest of the film genuinely doesn't, and that's disappointing. I think there's something resonant and very appealing about sea shanties because they're passed down from generation to generation, but we don't even get that many performances of those. In fact, what we do get in the movie is a mix between the actors and the real life band, who do actually have cameos scattered all throughout this movie, but it's just unfortunate because they just seem like props so much of the time. It's a real shame that the filmmakers have failed to capitalise on their very own idea, and it's made even worse by the fact that I think their characterisation often veers towards, kind of those soul-to-the-earth, gruff stereotypes that you see in a lot of variations of this kind of story, the kind of superstitious, don't trust outsiders. They change where they're from. They might be Irish, or in this case, Cornish, but they're pretty much written exactly the same way, and I just find it so trite. It's really just kind of stock writing instead of actually giving us proper characters. I mean, there are instances where it goes a little bit dramatic. Obviously, one of them has to pop their clogs over the course of writing time to give something dramatic to the movie, but otherwise, they're pretty much trundling along in the shadow of Daniel Mays' character. And I know that I'm being fairly harsh on the movie, which is only meant to be lightweight to begin with, and I do think, for many audience members, it will hold a lot of charm. There is something to be said about a movie that is quite pleasant and affable that you can just unwind to. Fisherman's Friends is that movie, but for me personally, those appeals were dimmed by the fact that it was nearly 2 hours long. This movie is 110 minutes, and it does not need to be. This seems to be one of a recent trend of films that are grossly overlong. At 90 minutes, I could have forgiven a lot of this film's faults, but at nearly 2 hours, that's the point where it starts becoming an endurance test. And there's one particular subplot that really pushes me over the Niagara. That is the Save the Pub subplot. Yep, this movie has one of those. So one of the fishermen owns the local pub, he's run out of money, and he needs to sell up. And so he turns to Danny for help because he doesn't want to tell anyone else about it. And you know exactly where that's going to lead. That's going to lead straight to the third act breakup because the movie has to hit that beat. This subplot is introduced fairly early on into the film with all the excitement of a meeting with the accountant, but it sort of appears very sporadically for a lot of it, long enough for you to forget that it was there. And there was a point 2/3 of the way through this movie where I thought it was wrapping up, and then suddenly a hideous thought crossed my mind of, wait, what about that pub subplot? Oh no, this movie has 20 minutes left. Oh no, oh no. And that's exactly what happened. Suddenly it reared its head right back into the story again, and the only reason it's there is to serve as a roadblock. It's there to delay the ending of the movie. That's pretty much it. And you know what the filmmakers should have done? They should have looked at their script, saw all the pages of this subplot, and just tore them out and threw them away. That's what they should have done, because suddenly, boom! 90-minute movie! All your problems are solved for the most part. And yet, the movie feels the need to just keep going and going. The problem isn't that it tells a very familiar story, it's that it takes 2 hours to tell it, and doesn't even tell it particularly well. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time griping about this movie and probably sounding a little bit meaner than I really intended, because I am very acutely aware this film is not made for me. So the fact that it didn't work for me, that's just proof that it works for its target audience, and that I can very much attest to. I was in an audience that seemed to be very happy with the film, that were considerably older than I was, and they really seemed to like it. They had an affinity for the group that I think was the reason they went to see this movie, and an easygoing movie in a lot of ways, and I think that that's the kind of film that people want in some instances, and I think that it does have its charms, particularly the location work in Port Isaac, which looks great in this movie. It looks really appetizing in a way that it could definitely serve as a video for their local tourist board. You can certainly imagine that the hotels there are going to be booked for months on end off of the back of this movie and people visiting and seeing the band, and it's good to see publicity for them. They seem like a really great bunch of people. I just didn't like the film. And you know what? So what? I think in the grand scheme of things, that's irrelevant. But I sure hope you were entertained. Fisherman's Friends is a mildly diverting sail into an ocean of cliches, with the film offering very few surprises. Despite being ostensibly based on a true story, the largely fictionalised plot is not only exceptionally stock, but strains credibility with its convoluted setup to try and disguise what is a very simple story in reality. The film's structure hits every beat you would expect, even if most of the time it isn't really earned or even properly established, almost expecting the audience's familiarity with this kind of tale to do the work for the filmmakers. Weirdly, it's the fishermen themselves that get the least to do, with only a handful of members given any prominence, and their characterization often veers towards twee, folksy stereotyping. While there will be some that will find this mild-mannered comedy charming, I found it weakly amusing at best, its slightness exacerbated by a nearly 2-hour running time thanks to a tedious save the pub subplot, and those outside the target audience will likely be all at sea. If you like this review, then you can set sail for my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.